It was at that moment that a shadow flickered, and Trevor looked up and saw the hawks. Many hawks. They had not seen him, they were not heeding the rocks in which he crouched. They were flying straight up the ravine, not circling or searching now but going with the sheer purposefulness, back the way he had come. He watched them uneasily. There were more than he had ever seen together before. But they flew on up the ravine without turning, and were gone. They weren't looking for me, he thought. But Trevor should have felt relieved, but he didn't. His uneasiness grew and grew, stemming from an inescapable conclusion. The hawks were going to the cave. They were heading toward it in an exact line, turning neither to right nor left, and this time they were not in any doubt. They, or whoever or whatever dominated them, knew this time exactly where to find the fugitives. But that's impossible, Trevor tried to tell himself. There's no way they could suddenly learn exactly where the cave is after all this time. No way. A thing was forcing its way up into Trevor's anxious thoughts, a realization that he did not want to look at squarely, not at all. But it would not be put down, it would not stop tormenting him, and suddenly he cried out to it, a cry of pain and guilt. No, it couldn't be. It couldn't be through me they learned. It fronted him relentlessly, the memory of that awful moment in the canyon when whatever had gripped him through the sunstone had seemed to be turning over the leaves of his brain like the pages of a book. The vast and alien mind that had gripped his in that dreadful contact had read his own brain clearly, he knew. And in Trevor's brain and memories it had found the secret of the cave. Trevor groaned in an agony of guilt. He crawled out of his rock heap and began to run back up the ravine, following the path the hawks had taken. There might still be time to warn them. Stumbling, running, he passed the canyon fork. And now from above him in the canyon he heard the sounds he dreaded, the sounds of women screaming and men shouting hoarsely in fury and despair. Farther on, over the rocks, scrambling, slipping, gasping for breath, he came to the cave mouth and the sight he had dreaded. The hawks had gone into the cave and driven out the slaves. They had them in the canyon now, and they were trying to herd them together and drive them down toward the lava beds. But the slaves were fighting back. Dark wings beat and thundered in the narrow gorge between the walls of rock. Claws struck and lashing tails cut like whips. Men struggled and floundered and trampled each other. Some died. Some of the hawks died too. But the people were being forced farther down the canyon under the relentless swooping of the hawks. Then Trevor saw Jen. She was a little way from the others. He was with her. He had shoved her into a protecting hollow and was standing over her with a piece of rock in his hands, trying to beat off a hawk. He was hurt badly. He was not doing well. Trevor uttered a wild cry that voiced all the futile rage in him, and bounded over a slope toward them. "Hugh, look out!" he yelled. The hawk had risen, and then had checked and turned, to swoop down straight at Hugh's back. Hugh swung partly around, but not soon enough. The hawk's claws were in his body, deep. Hugh fell down. Jen was screaming when Trevor reached them. He didn't stop to snatch up a rock. He threw himself onto the hawk that had welded itself to Hugh's back. There was a horrid slippery thrashing of wings under him, and the scaly neck of the thing was terribly strong between Trevor's hands. But not strong enough. He broke it. It was too late. When his sight cleared, Jen was staring in a strange wild way at the man and hawk lying tangled together in the dust. When Trevor touched her she fought him a little, not as though she saw him really, not as though she saw anything but Hugh's white ribs sticking out. "Jen, for God's sake, he's dead." Trevor tried to pull her away. "We've got to get away from here. There might be a chance." The Black Hawks were driving the humans down the canyon a little below them now, and if they could make the tumbled rocks below the cliff, there was a chance. 4. He had to drag Jen. Her face had gone utterly blank. In the next minute he realized that they would never reach the rocks, and that there was no chance, none at all. Back from the winged world that was driving the humans, 2 of the hawks came darting at them. Trevor swung Jen behind him and hoped fiercely that he could get another neck between his hands before they pulled him down. The dark shadows flashed down. He could see the sunstones glittering in their heads. They struck straight at him. But at the last split second they swerved away. Trevor waited. They came back again, very fast, but this time it was at Jen they struck, and not at him. He got her behind him again in time. And once more the hawks checked their strike. The truth dawned on Trevor. The hawks were deliberately refraining from hurting him. Whoever gives them their orders, the Corins or that other, doesn't want me hurt. He caught up Jen in his arms and started to run again toward the rocks. Instantly the hawks struck at Jen. He could not swing her clear in time. Blood ran from the long claw marks they left in her smooth, tan shoulders. Jen cried out. Trevor hesitated. He tried again for the rocks, and Jen moaned as a swift scaly head snapped at her neck. So that's it, Trevor thought furiously. I'm not to be hurt, but they can drive me through Jen. And they could, too. He would never get Jen to the concealment of the rocks alive, with those two wide-winged shadows staring at her. He had to go the way they wanted or they would leave her as they had left Hugh. All right, Trevor yelled savagely at the circling demons. Let her alone. I'll go where you want. He turned, still carrying Jen, plodding after the other slaves who were being herded down the canyon. All that day the Black Hawks drove the humans down the watercourse, around the shoulder of the salt and out onto the naked sun-seared lava bed. Some of them dropped and lay where they were, and no effort of the hawks could move them on again. Much of the time Trevor carried Jen. Part of the time he dragged her. For long vague periods he had no idea what he did. He was in a daze in which only his hatred still was vivid, when he felt Jen pulled away from him. He struggled, and was held, and he looked up to see a ring of mounted men around him. Corins on their crested beasts, the sunstones glittering in their brows. They looked down at Trevor, curious, speculative, hostile, their otherwise undistinguished human faces made strangely evil and otherworldly by the winking stones. You come with us to the city, one of them said curtly to Trevor. That woman goes with the other slaves. Trevor glared up at him. Why me, to the city? The Corin raised his riding whip threateningly. Do as you're ordered. Mount. Trevor saw that a slave had brought a saddled beast to him and was holding it, not looking either at him or the Corins. All right, he said. I'll go with you. He mounted and sat waiting, his eyes bright with the hatred that burned in him, bright as blown coals. They formed a circle around him and the leader gave a word. They galloped off toward the distant city. Trevor must have dozed as he rode, for suddenly it was sunset, and they were approaching the city. Seeing it as he had before, far off and with nothing to measure it against but the overtopping Titan peaks, it had seemed no more than a city built of rock. Now he was close to it. Black shadows lay on it, and on the valley, but halfway up the opposite mountain wall the light still blazed, reflected downward on the shallow sky, so that everything seemed to float in some curious dimension between night and day. Trevor stared, shut his eyes, and stared again. The size was wrong. He looked quickly at the Corins, with the eerie feeling that he might have shrunk to child size as he slept. But they had not changed, at least, relative to himself. He turned back to the city, trying to force it into perspective. It rose up starkly from the level plain. There was no gradual guttering out into suburbs, no softening down to garden villas or rows of cottages. It leapt up like a cliff and began, solemn, massive, squat, and ugly. The buildings were square, set stiffly along a square front. They were not tall. Most of them were only 1 story high. And yet Trevor felt dwarfed by them, as he had never felt dwarfed by the mightiest of Earth's skyscrapers. It was an unnatural feeling, and one that made him curiously afraid. There were no walls or gateways, no roads leading in. 1 minute the beasts padded on the grass of the open plain. The next, the claws were clicking on a stone pave and the buildings closed them in, hulking, graceless, looking sullen and forlorn in the shadowed light. There was no sound of them anywhere, no gleaming of lamps in the blackened braziers of cavernous stores. The last furious glare of the hidden sun seeped down from the high peaks and stained their upper walls, and they were old, half as old, Trevor thought, as the peaks themselves. It was the window embrasures, the doors, and the steps that led up to them that made Trevor understand suddenly what was wrong. And the latent fear that had been in him sprang to full growth. The city, and the buildings in it, the steps and the doors and the height of the windows, were perfectly in proportion, perfectly normal, if the people who lived there were 20 feet high. He turned to the Corporans. "You never built this place. Who built it?" The one called Galt, who was nearest him, snarled, "Quiet, slave." Trevor looked at him, and at the other Corporans. Something about their faces and the way they rode along the darkening empty street told him they too were afraid. He said, "You, the Corporans, the lordly demigods who ride about and send their hawks to hunt and slay, you're more afraid of your master than the slaves are of you." They turned toward him pallid faces that burned with hatred. He remembered how that other had gripped his brain back in the canyon. He remembered how it had felt. He understood many things now. He asked, "How does it feel to be enslaved, Corporans? Not just enslaved in body, but in mind and soul?" Galt turned like a striking snake. But the blow never fell. The upraised hand with the heavy whip suddenly checked, and then sank down again. Only the eyes of the Corran glowed with the baleful helplessness under the winking sunstone. Trevor laughed without humor. "It wants me alive. I guess I'm safe, then. I guess I could tell you what I think of you. You're still convicts, aren't you? After 300 years. No wonder you hate the slaves." Not the same convicts, of course. The sunstones didn't give longevity. Trevor knew how the Corporans propagated, stealing women from among the slaves, keeping the male children and killing the female. He laughed again. "It isn't such a good life after all, is it, being a Corran? Even hunting and killing can't take the taste out of your mouths. No wonder you hate the others. They're enslaved, all right, but they're not owned." They would have liked to kill him but they could not. They were forbidden. Trevor looked at them, in the last pale flicker of the afterglow. The jewels in the splendid harness, the bridles of the beasts heavy with gold, the weapons, they looked foolish now, like the paper crowns and glass beads that children deck themselves with when they pretend to be kings. These were not lords and masters. These were only little men, and slaves. And the sunstones were a badge of shame. The cavalcade passed on. Empty streets, empty houses with windows too high for human eyes to look through and steps too tall for human legs to climb. Full dark, and the first stunning crash of thunder, the first blaze of lightning between the cliffs. The mounts were hurrying now, almost galloping to beat the lightning and the scalding rain. They were in a great square. Around it was a stiff rectangle of houses, and these were lighted with torchlight, and in the monstrous doorways here and there a little figure stood, a Corran, watching. In the exact center of the square was a flat low structure of stone, having no windows and but a single door. They reined the beasts before that lightless entrance. "Get down," said Galt to Trevor. A livid reddish flaring in the sky showed Trevor the Corran's face, and it was smiling, as a wolf smiles before the kill. Then the thunder came, the downpour of rain, and he was thrust bodily into the doorway. He stumbled over worn flagging in the utter dark, but the Corporans moved sure-footedly as cats. He knew they had been here many times before, and he knew that they hated it. He could feel the hate and the fear bristling out from the bodies that were close to his, smell them in the close hot air. They didn't want to be here but they had to. They were bidden. He would have fallen headforemost down the sudden flight of steps if someone had not caught his arm. They were huge steps. They were forced to go down them as small children do, lowering themselves bodily from tread to tread. A furnace blast of air came up the well, but in spite of the heat Trevor felt cold. He could feel how the hard stone of the stairs had been worn into deep hollows by the passing of feet. Whose feet? And going where? A sulphurous glow began to creep up through the darkness. They went down what seemed a very long way. The glow brightened, so that Trevor could once more make out the faces of the Corporans. The heat was overpowering, but still there was a coldness around Trevor's heart. The steps ended in a long low hall, so long that the farther end of it was lost in vaporous shadow. Trevor thought that it must have been squared out of a natural cavern, for here and there in the rocky floor small fumaroles burned and bubbled, giving off the murky light and the reek of brimstone. Along both sides of the hall were rows of statues seated in stone chairs. Trevor stared at them, with the skin crawling up and down his back. Statues of men and women, or rather, of creatures manlike and womanlike, sitting solemn and naked, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes, fashioned of dull, reddish stone, looking straight ahead, their features even and composed, with a strange sad patience clinging to the stony furrows around mouth and cheek. Statues that would be perhaps 20 feet tall if they were standing, carved by a master's chisel out of a pale substance that looked like alabaster. Galt caught his arm. "Oh, no, you won't run away. You were laughing, remember? Come on, I want to see you laugh some more." They forced him along between the rows of statues. Quiet statues, with a curiously ghostly look of thoughtfulness, of thoughts and feelings long vanished but once there, different from those of humans, perhaps, but quite as strong. No two of them were alike, in face or body. Trevor noted among them things seldom seen in statues, a maimed limb, a deformity, or a completely nondescript face that would offer neither beauty nor ugliness for an artist to enlarge upon. Also, they seemed all to be old, though he could not have said why he thought so. There were other halls opening off this main one. How far they went he had no means of guessing, but he could see that in them were rather shadowy rows of seated figures. Statues? Endless numbers of statues, down here in the darkness underneath the city. He stopped, bracing himself against his captors, gripping the hot rock with his bare feet. "This is a catacomb," he said. "Those aren't statues, they're bodies, dead things sitting up." "Come on," said Galt. "Come on, and laugh." They took him, and there were too many to fight. And Trevor knew that it was not them he had to fight. Something was waiting for him down in that catacomb. It had had his mind once. It would. They were approaching the end of the long hall. The sickly light from the fumaroles showed the last of the lines of seated figures. Had they died there like that, sitting up, or had they been brought here afterward? The rows on each side ended evenly, the last chairs exactly opposite each other. But against the blank end wall was a solitary seat of stone, facing down the full gloomy length of the hall, and on it sat a man-like shape of alabaster, very still, the stony hands folded rigidly upon the stony thighs. A figure no different from the others, except that the eyes were still alive. The curtains dropped back a little. All but Galt. He stayed beside Trevor, his head bent, his mouth sullen and nervous, not looking up at all. And Trevor stared into the remote and somber eyes that were like two pieces of carnelian in that pale alabaster face, and yet were living, sentient, full of a deep and alien sorrow. It was very silent in the catacomb. The dreadful eyes studied Trevor, and for just a moment his hatred was tempered by a strange pity as he thought what it must be like for the brain, the intelligence behind those eyes, already entombed, and knowing it. A long living and a long dying. The blessing and the curse of my people. The words were soundliness, spoken inside his brain. Trevor started violently. Almost he turned to flee, remembering the torture of that moment in the canyon, and then he found that while he had been staring, a force as gentle and stealthy as the gliding of a shadow had already invaded him. And he was forbidden. "At this range I do not need the sunstones," murmured a silent voice within him. "Once I did not need them at all. But I am old." Trevor stared at the stony thing that watched him, and then he thought of Jen, of Hugh lying dead with a dead hawk in the dust, and the strangeness left him, and his bitter passion flared again. "So you hate me as well as fear me, little human? You would destroy me?" There was a gentle laughter inside Trevor's mind. "I have watched generations of humans die so swiftly. And yet I am here, as I was before they came, waiting." "You won't be here forever," snarled Trevor. "These others like you died. You will. Yes. But it is a slow dying, little human. Your body chemistry is like that of the plants, the beasts, based upon carbon. Quick to grow. Quick to wither away. Ours was of another sort. We were like the mountains, cousin to them. Our body cells built of silicon, even as theirs. And so our flesh endures until it grows slow and stiff with age. But even then we must wait long, very long, for death. Something of the truth of that long waiting came to Trevor, and he felt a shuddering thankfulness for the frailty of human flesh. I am the last, whispered the silent voice. For a while I had companionship of minds, but the others are all gone before me, long ago. Trevor had a nightmare vision of Mercury, in some incalculable future eon, a frozen world taking its last plunge into the burned-out sun, bearing with it these endless rows of alabaster shapes, sitting in their chairs of stone, upright in the dead blackness underneath the ice. He fought back to reality, clutching his hatred as a swimmer clings to a plank, his voice raw with passion and bitterness as he cried out. Yes, I'll destroy you if I can. What else could you expect after what you've done? Oh, no, little human, you will not destroy me. You will help me. Trevor glared. Help you? Not if you kill me. There will be no killing. You would be of no use to me dead. But alive you can serve me. That is why you were spared. Serve you, like them? He swung to point to the waiting Courins, but the Courins were not waiting now, they were closing in on him, their hands reaching for him. Trevor struck out at them. He had a fleeting thought of how this battle of his with the Courins must look, as they struck and staggered on the stone paving beneath the looming, watching thing of stone. But even as he had that thought, the moment of struggle ended. An imperious command hit his brain, and black oblivion closed down upon him like the sudden clenching of a fist. Darkness. He was lost in it, and he was not himself any more. He fled through the darkness, groping, crying out for something that was gone. And a voice answered him, a voice that he did not want to hear. Darkness. Dreams. Dawn, high on the blazing mountains. He stood in the city, watching the light grow bright and pitiless, watching it burn on the upper walls and then slip downward into the streets, casting heavy shadows in the openings of door and window, so that the houses looked like skulls with empty eye holes and gaping mouths. The buildings no longer seemed too big. He walked between them, and when he came to steps he climbed them easily, and the window ledges were no higher than his head. He knew these buildings. He looked at each one as he passed, naming it, remembering with a long, long memory. The hawks came down to him, the faithful servants with the sunstones in their brows. He stroked their pliant necks, and they hissed softly with pleasure, but their shallow minds were empty of everything but that vague sensation. He passed on through the familiar streets, and in them nothing stirred. All through the day from dawn to sunset, and in the darkness that came afterward, nothing stirred, and there was a silence among the stones. He could not endure the city. His time was not yet, though the first subtle signs of age had touched him. But he went down into the catacombs and took his place with those others who were waiting and could still speak to him with their minds, so that he should not be quite alone with the silence. The years went by, leaving no traces of themselves in the unchanging gloom of the mortuary halls. One by one those last few minds were stilled until all were gone. And by that time age had chained him where he was, unable to rise and go again into the city where he had been young, the youngest of all. SHANNACH, they had named him, the last. So he waited, alone. And only one who was kin to the mountains could have borne that waiting in the place of the dead. Then, in a burst of flame and thunder, new life came into the valley. Human life. Soft, frail, receptive life, intelligent, unprotected, possessed of violent and bewildering passions. Very carefully, taking its time, the mind of SHANNACH reached out and gathered them in. Some of the men were more violent than the others. SHANNACH saw their emotions in patterns of scarlet against the dark of his inner mind. They had already made themselves masters, and a number of these frail sensitive brains had snapped out swiftly because of them. These I will take for my own, thought SHANNACH. Their mind patterns are crude, but strong, and I am interested in death. There had been a surgeon aboard the ship, but he was dead. However, there was no need of a surgeon for what was about to be done. When SHANNACH had finished talking to the men he had chosen, telling them of the Sunstones, telling them the truth, but not all of it, when those men had eagerly agreed to the promise of power, SHANNACH took complete control. And the clumsy convict hands that moved now with such exquisite skill were as much his instruments as the scalpels of the dead surgeon that they wielded, making the round incision and the delicate cutting of the bone. Who was the man that lay there, quiet under the knife? Who were the ones that bent above him, with the strange stones in their brows? Names. There are names and I know them. Closer, closer. I know that man who lies there with blood between his eyes. Trevor screamed. Someone slapped him across the face, viciously and with intent. He screamed again, fighting, clawing, still blinded by the visions and the dark mists, and that voice that he dreaded so much spoke gently in his mind. It's all over, Trevor. It is done. The hard hand slapped him again, and a rough human voice said harshly, Wake up! Wake up, damn it! He woke. He was in the middle of a vast room, crouched down in the attitude of a fighter, shivering, sweating, his hands outstretched and grasping nothing. He must have sprung there, half unconscious, from the tumbled pallet of skins against the wall. Galt was watching him. Welcome, Earthman. How does it feel to be one of the masters? Trevor stared at him. A burning flood of light fell in through the tall windows so high above his head, setting the sunstone ablaze between the Karen's sullen brows. Trevor's gaze fixed on that single point of brilliance. Oh, yes, said Galt. It's true. It struck Trevor with an ugly shock that Galt's lips had not moved, and that he had made no audible sound. The stones give us a limited ability, Galt went on, still without speaking aloud. Not like his, of course. But we can control the hawks, and exchange ideas between us when we want to if the range isn't too far. Naturally, our minds are open to him any time he wants to pry. There's no pain, Trevor whispered, desperately trying to make the thing not be so. My head doesn't ache. Of course not. He takes care of that. SHANNACH? If it isn't so, how do I know that name? And that dream, that endless nightmare in the catacombs? Galt winced. We don't use that name. He doesn't like it. He looked at Trevor. What's the matter, Earthman? Why so green? You were laughing once, remember? Where's your sense of humor now? He caught Trevor abruptly by the shoulders and turned him around so that he faced a great sheet of polished glassy substance set into the wall. A mirror for giants, reflecting the whole huge room, reflecting the small dwarfed figures of the men. Go on, said Galt, pushing Trevor ahead of him. Take a look. Trevor shook off the Karen's grasp. He moved forward by himself, close to the mirror. He set his hands against the chill surface and stared at what he saw there. And it was true. Between his brows a sunstone winked and glittered. And his face, the familiar, normal, not too bad face he had been used to all his life, was transformed into something monstrous and unnatural, a goblin mask with a third, and evil eye. A coldness crept onto his heart and bones. He backed away a little from the mirror, his hands moving blindly upward, slowly toward the stone that glistened between his brows. His mouth was twisted like a child's, and hot tears rolled down his cheeks. His fingers touched the stone. And then the anger came. He sank his nails into his forehead, clawing at the hard stones, not caring if he died after he had torn it out. Galt watched him. His lips smiled but his eyes were hateful. Blood ran down the sides of Trevor's nose. The sunstone was still there. He moaned and thrust his nails in deeper, and SHANNACH let him go until he had produced one stab of agony that cut his head in two and nearly dropped him. Then SHANNACH sent in the full force of his mind. Not in anger, for he felt none, and not in cruelty, for he was no more cruel than the mountain he was kin to, but simply because it was necessary. Trevor felt that cold and lonely power roll down on him like an avalanche. He braced himself to meet it, but it broke his defenses, crushed them, made them nothing, and moved onward against the inmost citadel of his mind. In that reeling, darkened fortress all that was holy, Trevor crouched and clung to its armament of rage, remembering dimly that once, in a narrow canyon, it had driven back this enemy and broken free. And then some crude animal instinct far below the level of conscious thought warned him not to press the battle now, to bury his small weapon and wait, letting this last redoubt of which he was yet master go untouched and perhaps unnoticed by his captor. Trevor let his hands drop limply and his mind go slack. The cold black tide of power paused, and then he felt it slide away, withdrawing from those threatened walls. Out of the edges of it, SHANNACH spoke. Your mind is tougher than these valley-bred Corporans. They're well-conditioned, but you remember that you defied me once. The contact was imperfect then. It is not imperfect now. Remember that, too, Trevor. Trevor drew in a long, unsteady breath. He whispered, "What do you want of me?" "Go and see the ship. Your mind tells me that it understands these things. See if it can be made to fly again." That order took Trevor completely by surprise. The ship? But why? SHANNACH was not used to having his wishes questioned, but he answered patiently, "I have still a while to live. Several of your short generations. I have had too much of this valley, too much of these catacombs. I want to leave them." Trevor could understand that. Having had that nightmare glimpse into SHANNACH's mind, he could perfectly understand. For one brief moment he was torn with pity for this trapped creature who was alone in the universe. And then he wondered, what would you do if you could leave the valley? What would you do to another settlement of men? Who knows? I have one thing left to me, curiosity. You'd take the Corporans with you, and the Hawks? Some. They are my eyes and ears, my hands and feet. But you object, Trevor. What difference does that make? Said Trevor bitterly. I'll go look at the ship. Come on, said Galt, taking up an armful of torches. I'll show you the way. They went out through the tall door into the streets between the huge square empty houses. The streets and houses that Trevor had known in his dream, remembering when there were lights and voices in them. Trevor noticed only that Galt was leading him out on the opposite side of the city, toward the part of the valley he had never visited. And then his mind reverted to something that not even the shock of his awakening could drive out of his consciousness. Jen. A sudden panic sprang up in him. How long had it been since the darkness fell on him there in the catacomb? Long enough for almost anything to happen. He envisioned Jen being torn by hawks, of her body lying dead as Hughes had lain, and he started to reach out for Galt, who had owned them both. But abruptly SHANNACH spoke to him, in that eerie silent way he was getting used to. The woman is safe. Here, look for yourself. His mind was taken firmly and directed into a channel completely new to him. He felt a curious small shock of contact, and suddenly he was looking down from a point somewhere in the sky at a walled paddock with a number of the tiny figures in it. His own eyes would have seen them as just that, but the eyes he was using now were keen as an eagle's, though they saw no color but only black and white and the shadings in between. So he recognized one of the distant figures as Jen. He wanted to get closer to her, much closer, and rather sulkily his point of vision began to circle down, dropping lower and lower. Jen looked up. He saw the shadow of wide wings sweep across her and realized that of course he was using one of the hawks. He pulled it back so as not to frighten her, but not before he had seen her face. The frozen stoniness was gone, and in its place had come the look of a wounding tigress. I want her, Trevor said to SHANNACH. She belongs to Galt. I do not interfere. Galt shrugged. You're welcome. But keep her chained. She's too dangerous now for anything but hawk meat. The ship was not far beyond the city. It lay canted over on its side, just clear of a low spur jutting out from the barrier cliff. It had hit hard, and some of the main plates were buckled, but from the outside the damage did not seem irreparable, if you had the knowledge and the tools to work with. 300 years ago it might have been made to fly again, only those who had the knowledge and the will were dead. And the convicts wanted to stay where they were. The tough metal of the outer skin, alloyed to resist friction that could burn up a meteor, had stood up pretty well under 3 centuries of Mercurian climate. It was corroded, and where the breaks were the inner shells were eaten through with rust, but the hulk still retained the semblance of a ship. "Will it fly?" asked SHANNACH eagerly. "I don't know yet," Trevor answered. Galt lighted a torch and gave it to him. "I'll stay out here." Trevor laughed. "How are you ever going to fly over the mountains?" "He'll see to that when the time comes," Galt muttered. "Take the rest of these torches. It's dark in there." Trevor climbed in through the gaping lock, moving with great caution on the tilted, rust-red decks. Inside, the ship was a shambles. Everything had been stripped out of it that could be used, leaving only bare cubicles with the enamel peeling off the walls and a moldering litter of junk. In a locker forward of the airlock he found a number of spacesuits. The fabric was rotted away, but a few of the helmets were still good and some half-score of the oxygen bottles had survived, the gas still in them. SHANNACH urged him on impatiently. "Get to the essentials, Trevor." The bridge room was still intact, though the multiple thickness of glassite in the big ports showed patterns of spidery cracks. Trevor examined the controls. He was strictly a planetary spacer, used to flying his small craft within spitting distance of the world he was prospecting, and there were a few gadgets here he didn't understand, but he could figure the board well enough. "Not far, Trevor. Only over the mountains. I know from your mind, and I remember from the minds of those who died after the landing, that beyond the mountain wall there is a plain of dead rock, more than 100 of your reckoning in miles, and then another ridge that seems solid but is not, and beyond that pass there is a fertile valley 20 times bigger than Earth, where Earthmen live. Only partly fertile, and the mines that brought the Earthmen are pretty well worked out. But a few ships still land there, and a few Earthmen still hang on. That is best. A small place, to begin." "To begin what?" "Who can tell? You don't understand, Trevor. For centuries I have known exactly what I would do. There is a kind of rebirth in not knowing." Trevor shivered and went back to studying the controls. The wiring, protected by layers of imperviplast insulation and conduit, seemed to be in fair shape. The generator room below had been knocked about, but not too badly. There were spare batteries. Corroded, yes, but if they were charged, they could hold for a while. "Will it fly?" "I told you I don't know yet. It would take a lot of work. There are many Slavs to do this work." "Yes. But without fuel it's all useless." "See if there is fuel." The outlines of that hidden thing in Trevor's secret mind were coming clearer now. He didn't want to see them out in the full light where SHANNACH could see them too. He thought hard about generators, batteries, and the hooking up of leads. He crept among the dark bowels of the dead ship, working toward the stern. The torch made a red and smoky glare that lit up deserted wardrooms and plundered holds. One large compartment had a heavy barred and bolted door that had bent like tin in the crash. That's where they came from, Trevor thought, like wolves out of a trap. In the lower holds that had taken the worst of the impact were quantities of mining equipment and farm machinery, all smashed beyond use but formidable looking nonetheless, with rusty blades and teeth and queer hulking shapes. They made him think of weapons, and he let the thought grow, adorning it with pictures of men going down under whirring reapers. SHANNACH caught it. Weapons? They could be used as such. But the metal in them would repair the hull. He found the fuel bunkers. The main supply was used to the last grain of fissionable dust, but the emergency bunkers still showed some content on the mechanical gauges. Not much, but enough.